They were beautiful the way car crashes are beautiful, impossible to look away from, terrible to witness, somehow inevitable. Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love burned through each other like matched fires, 3 times consuming what they most needed. First their solitude, then their sanity, and finally their capacity to believe that love could be anything other than catastrophic. The world watched them destroy each other slowly, publicly, with the kind of fascination usually reserved for disasters. And perhaps that's exactly what they were. He met her in 1990, before the fame swallowed him whole, when he was still just a skinny kid from Aberdeen who wrote sad songs in his car. She was already chaos incarnate. Louder than he was quiet, confrontational where he retreated, everything he feared and craved in one package. They recognized each other instantly, the way wounded animals recognize the scent of shared trauma. Both had been abandoned by parents. Both had weaponized their damage into art. Both understood that the world was fundamentally cruel, and they might as well be cruel right back. The marriage happened fast, the pregnancy faster, and suddenly, Kurt Cobain, who could barely take care of himself, had a wife as volatile as dynamite and a daughter as fragile as glass. The tabloids called Courtney a bad influence, as if Kurt needed help finding ways to self-destruct. They called her manipulative, ambitious, dangerous. They weren't wrong, but they weren't right either. What they were was 2 people drowning, clinging to each other, dragging each other deeper. The love was real. The damage was real. Both things could be true simultaneously. By the end, no one could say where Kurt ended and Courtney began, where his addiction fed hers and hers fed his, where his depression amplified hers and hers reflected his back doubled. They had become a closed system of mutual destruction, a feedback loop of need and harm. And when he left, first through separation, then permanently through death, he left her to carry not just her own chaos, but the blame for his as well. The world needed someone to fault, and the widow in ripped tights and smeared makeup made an easy target. But Kurt Cobain's tragedy wasn't that he loved Courtney Love. It was that he loved her the only way he knew how, completely, toxically, without reservation or survival instinct. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like the video for your support. Thank you for subscribing. The first time Kurt Cobain saw Courtney Love, she was screaming at someone in a Portland nightclub, and he thought she was the most magnetic creature he'd ever witnessed. This was January 1990, in the basement of Satyricon, where the walls sweated condensation and the air tasted like spilled beer and cigarette ash. Nirvana was still small enough to play venues like this, still hungry enough to load their own equipment, still innocent enough to believe that success wouldn't change anything essential about who they were. Courtney was 25, blonde and fierce, wearing a torn baby doll dress that might have been vintage or might have just been old, her lipstick smeared like she'd been kissing chaos itself. She fronted a band called Hole, and they were terrible in exactly the way Kurt appreciated: raw, unpolished, dangerous. She sang like she was trying to claw her way out of her own throat. He watched from the shadows, this thin boy with dirty blonde hair hanging in his ice-blue eyes, and recognized something he'd been searching for without knowing it. Someone as damaged as he was, someone as angry, someone who understood that prettiness could be weaponized. They didn't speak that night. He was too shy. She was too occupied with whatever argument had her attention. But he asked around. Found out she'd been everywhere. England, where she'd stripped and dealt drugs. Hollywood, where she'd acted in small roles and bigger scandals. The punk scene in Minneapolis and Portland, collecting experiences like other people collected stamps. She was dangerous, everyone said, manipulative, crazy, which only made Kurt more interested, because he'd spent his whole life being called crazy by people who didn't understand that sanity was just another form of conformity. Aberdeen had taught him that early. The logging town on Washington's grey coast, where rain fell like punishment and divorce was epidemic, where his parents had split when he was 9, and neither had particularly wanted custody. His mother had been violent in her affection and violent in her anger. His father had remarried quickly, started a new family, made it clear that Kurt was a remainder from an equation already solved. So Kurt had learned to live in margins, at friends' houses, in his car, under a bridge over the Wishka River, where he'd huddle in a sleeping bag and write songs about isolation that felt less like poetry and more like field reports from the front lines of loneliness. The guitar had saved him, or at least given him a language for the screaming inside his head. He'd formed Nirvana with Chris Novoselic, a bassist as tall as Kurt was short, and together they'd channeled Aberdeen's greyness into noise, beautiful, ugly, deliberately imperfect noise. Their first album, Bleach, had cost $600 to record and sold 30,000 copies, which felt like success until you realized 30,000 copies meant 30,000 people had heard your pain, and most of them were probably drunk when they bought it. But something was building. Kurt could feel it in the crowds that were getting larger, in the way college radio stations were starting to play their songs, in the interest from major labels who wanted to package grunge like it was a brand instead of a state of being. Nirvana had signed with DGC Records, a subsidiary of Geffen, and they were about to record their second album with Butch Vig, a producer who understood that you could make ugly music sound expensive. Kurt was 23 years old, living in Olympia, Washington, dating a riot girl named Toby Vale, who was everything Courtney Love wasn't: quiet, stable, contained. And maybe that was the problem. When Courtney called him months after that first sighting, Kurt's heart performed gymnastics he didn't know it was capable of. She'd gotten his number from a mutual friend, she said. She wanted to talk about music, about art, about the fact that they were both trying to do something real in a scene that was rapidly becoming commercial. Her voice on the phone was surprisingly soft, almost vulnerable, nothing like the screaming harpy he'd witnessed on stage. They talked for 3 hours that first night, then 4 hours the next night, then every night for a week. She told him about growing up in foster care, about a mother who gave her LSD at age 4, about learning early that the world wouldn't protect you, so you'd better become unprotectable. He told her things he'd never told Toby, things he'd barely admitted to himself, about the chronic stomach pain that felt like swallowing razors, the way food hurt and pills helped, the depression that came in waves so black he couldn't see the shore, about hating fame before he'd even experienced it, knowing somehow that visibility would be suffocating, that the world would want explanations, and he only had howls. Courtney understood, more than understood. She validated. The pain wasn't weakness, she insisted. It was proof of sensitivity, evidence of depth. The world crushed beautiful things, she said, and they should crush it right back. By May 1991, Kurt had broken up with Toby and was officially with Courtney, though officially seemed like the wrong word for something so combustible. They were more like two chemicals that shouldn't be mixed, exciting precisely because of the danger. Nirvana's new album, Nevermind, was set to release in September, and everyone involved knew it was something special, though no one predicted it would become what it became. The lead single, Smells Like Teen Spirit, was 4 minutes of controlled chaos, quiet verses exploding into screaming choruses, lyrics that made no sense but felt like they explained everything. Kurt had wanted it to sound like the Pixies, that soft, loud, soft dynamic, the musical equivalent of a nervous breakdown. The music video was supposed to air once on MTV, late at night, when only insomniacs and teenagers would see it. Instead, it went into heavy rotation. By October, you couldn't escape it. The song climbed the charts like it was angry at gravity, pushing aside Michael Jackson and Guns N' Roses, rewriting the rules about what rock music could sound like. Kurt watched his own face appear on television, on magazine covers, on T-shirts worn by people who didn't understand what the song was actually about. He'd written it as a satire of pop music, a joke about how easy it was to manipulate audiences, and the audiences had responded by making it the anthem of their generation. Courtney thought it was hilarious. She'd been chasing fame for years, acting in small films, shopping Hole's demos to labels, networking at parties Kurt would never attend, and here he was, stumbling into massive success while actively resenting it. But she also understood his discomfort in ways others didn't. Fame wasn't the prize everyone pretended it was, she said. It was a trap disguised as victory. The more successful you became, the less you belonged to yourself. Your image became public property. Your pain became entertainment. Your authenticity became the very thing people consumed and destroyed. They got engaged in August 1991, on a beach, with a ceremony that involved no rings and no planning, just a mutual recognition that they were already too entangled to separate. Courtney was pregnant by November. Kurt was thrilled and terrified in equal measure. A baby meant responsibility, stability, sobriety, all the things his life actively resisted. His stomach pain was getting worse, the burning that started as a medical mystery and ended in whatever pills he could find. Doctors prescribed him Vicodin, Percocet, anything that might help. Nothing helped for long. The only thing that touched the pain was heroin, which he'd started using casually in 1990 and less casually by 1991. Heroin was democracy's cruelest equation. It didn't care about your guitar skills, your lyrics, your suddenly full bank account. It wanted everything, and it took payment daily. Courtney had her own history with opiates, her own reasons for needing chemicals to survive chemicals. They told themselves they could control it, that they were smarter than addiction, that artists throughout history had used drugs and survived. They were 24 and 27, respectively, which felt old enough to make your own mistakes, but young enough to believe mistakes were survivable. The wedding happened February 24th, 1992, on Waikiki Beach in Hawaii. Courtney wore a satin dress that had belonged to Frances Farmer, the troubled actress from the 1930s who'd been lobotomized and destroyed by Hollywood. It seemed like an omen no one wanted to read. Kurt wore pajamas because the ceremony felt absurd anyway. Because marriage was a social construct he'd been raised to distrust. Because his stomach hurt so badly he could barely stand. They exchanged vows while high, which people would later point to as proof of corruption, but which felt at the time like the only way to get through the performance of normalcy. Francis Bean Cobain was born August 18, 1992, in Los Angeles. 7 pounds 1 ounce of perfect vulnerability. Kurt held her like she was made of light, this tiny creature with her mother's features and his ice-blue eyes, and felt love so overwhelming it hurt worse than any stomach pain. He'd brought his journals to the hospital, filling pages with observations about her impossibly small fingers, her startling alertness, the way she looked at him like she knew him already. Courtney had fought through a difficult delivery, refusing most pain medication because she was trying to stay clean for the baby, her body shaking with withdrawal as much as labor. The problems started immediately. Someone, a nurse, a social worker, someone whose identity was never confirmed, had contacted Vanity Fair magazine about the new parents. An article was scheduled to run in September, and the reporter, Lynn Hirschberg, had apparently interviewed Courtney at length about her drug use. When the article appeared, with its incendiary claim that Courtney had used heroin while pregnant, the media erupted. Child Protective Services got involved. The headlines screamed, "Courtney Love, Queen of the Junkies, wasn't journalism, it was character assassination. Kurt and Courtney lost custody of Francis Bean for a month. The court required weekly urine tests, supervised visits, mandatory drug counseling." Kurt, who'd spent his entire life being abandoned by systems that were supposed to protect him, now watched those same systems threaten to take his daughter. Courtney, who'd never had stability in her own childhood, was being painted as exactly the kind of unfit mother her own mother had been. The irony was savage. They'd both spent years building walls against the world's judgment, and parenthood had stripped every defense away. They got Francis back, eventually. Hired lawyers, passed drug tests, convinced courts they could be stable. But something had broken that wouldn't heal. Kurt looked at his daughter and saw the person who needed him most, and looked at himself and saw someone fundamentally incapable of providing what was needed. The stomach pain was constant now. The depression came in waves that lasted weeks. He'd go on tour, because that's what rock stars did, because the label expected it, because millions of people wanted to watch him perform his own discomfort, and call home crying, begging Courtney to understand that he couldn't do this, couldn't be the person everyone needed him to be. In Utero, Nirvana's third album, came out in September 1993, and it was everything Nevermind wasn't: abrasive, uncomfortable, deliberately unmarketable. Kurt had produced it with Steve Albini, known for his raw, unpolished sound, specifically to alienate the mainstream audience that had adopted Nirvana against Kurt's will. Songs like Rape Me and Milk It weren't designed for radio play. They were designed to say, if you think you know me, you're wrong. If you think I'm your spokesperson, find someone else. If you think I owe you accessibility, understand that accessibility itself is violence. The album went to #1 anyway. The critics loved it. The fans loved it. MTV put it in heavy rotation. Kurt had tried to commit commercial suicide, and the market had rewarded him for it. There was no escape. Authenticity itself had become his brand. His refusal to play the game had become the thing people consumed. He was trapped in a cage made of his own honesty. At home, things were disintegrating in slow motion. Kurt and Courtney fought constantly, screaming matches that mixed legitimate grievances with drug-fueled paranoia, where yesterday's apology became today's ammunition. He accused her of being too ambitious, too loud, too desperate for the fame he was trying to escape. She accused him of being too passive, too nihilistic, too willing to die slowly rather than fight for their family. Both accusations were true. The love hadn't died. Love wasn't the problem. The problem was that they were both drowning, and drowning people pull each other under. On March 4th, 1994, Nirvana played what would be their final concert in Munich, Germany. Kurt was so sick he could barely stand, so high he could barely function, so depressed he'd attempted suicide the night before by overdosing on Rohypnol and champagne. Courtney had found him unconscious, called an ambulance, saved his life while he resented her for it. On stage in Munich, he looked like a ghost, his thin frame swimming in an oversized cardigan, his ice-blue eyes vacant as tundra. He played mechanically, forgetting lyrics, cutting songs short. The crowd thought it was artistry. It was actually dying in public. 2 days later, in Rome, he tried again. Another overdose, more pills, a note left on the nightstand that Courtney would later say was a suicide note, and investigators would call an accident. He survived, barely. Woke up in a hospital where doctors pumped his stomach and psychiatrists asked questions he couldn't answer. How do you explain that existence itself had become unbearable? That fame was suffocating? That every breath felt like inhaling glass? That the person you loved most had become indistinguishable from the thing destroying you? Courtney arranged an intervention. Late March 1994, at their house in Seattle, she gathered friends, family, bandmates. They sat in a circle and told Kurt they loved him, that they needed him, that he had to get help. He agreed to go to rehab, Exodus Recovery Center in Los Angeles, not because he wanted to get clean, but because it was easier than fighting. He checked in March 30th, stayed 2 days, then climbed a 6-foot fence and caught a flight back to Seattle. His last words to the counselors were that he wanted to go outside for a cigarette. He never came back. The next week was spent in hiding. Kurt stayed in various locations, a hotel room, a drug dealer's apartment, finally the greenhouse above the garage of the house he shared with Courtney. She was in Los Angeles, frantic, hiring private investigators, calling police, begging anyone who'd listen to help find her husband before he did something irreversible. But Seattle is a city that knows how to keep secrets, and Kurt knew how to disappear. He'd been practicing his whole life. On April 5th, 1994, sometime in the morning, Kurt Cobain put a shotgun in his mouth and ended the conversation. He left a note, quoting Neil Young, "It's better to burn out than to fade away," and adding his own thoughts about not feeling the music anymore, about being a miserable, complaining fool. The note was addressed to his childhood imaginary friend, Bodder, as if in death he'd regressed to the age before the world broke him. He was 27 years old, the same age as Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, all the other bright things that burned out too fast. An electrician found him April 8th, 3 days after death, the body already decomposing in the greenhouse warmth. The shotgun was still in his hand. The heroin was still in his bloodstream, enough to kill a person on its own, though the medical examiner would say the gunshot came first. News outlets interrupted regular programming to announce what fans already knew in their bones. The voice of Generation X had gone permanently silent. Courtney Love was in Los Angeles when police called. She screamed so loudly, hotel guests thought someone was being murdered, which, in a way, someone was. The version of herself that had believed love could save them both. She flew to Seattle, spoke at a vigil in Veretta Park, where thousands gathered to mourn, reading portions of Kurt's suicide note, while her voice broke and rebuilt and broke again. People booed when she cried. They thought she was performing. Maybe she was. Maybe performance was all any of them had left. The blame came swift and vicious. Courtney Love had killed him, the media decided. Not literally, even the conspiracy theorists struggled with that one, but spiritually, emotionally, through her mere existence. She was too loud, too ambitious, too much. If she'd been quieter, gentler, less herself, maybe he'd have survived. The narrative wrote itself. Brilliant, sensitive artist destroyed by manipulative, fame-hungry wife. It was easier than the truth, which was that Kurt Cobain had been in pain long before Courtney Love, that his depression was clinical and chemical, and not anyone's fault, that sometimes love isn't enough, and marriage can't cure, and even the most beautiful baby in the world can't overcome the gravity of despair. Frances Bean was 20 months old when her father died. She wouldn't remember him, not really. Just fragments, the timbre of his voice on old answering machine tapes, the photographs that made him look like a stranger, the music that meant everything to everyone except the little girl who just wanted a dad. Courtney raised her alone in the glare of public judgment, every parenting mistake magnified and catalogued as proof of inherent corruption. When Frances turned 13, she went to live with her grandmother, Courtney's mother, the same woman who'd given Courtney LSD as a child. The cycle of damage didn't break, it just reconfigured. Nirvana's music didn't die with Kurt. If anything, it grew louder, more omnipresent. Nevermind became one of the best-selling albums of all time, its iconic cover, a naked baby, swimming toward a dollar bill on a fishhook, a perfect metaphor for innocence destroyed by capitalism. Smells Like Teen Spirit was named one of the greatest songs ever recorded. Kurt's journals were published, his demos released, his privacy posthumously violated in the name of legacy management. He'd spent his life hating commodification, and death made him the ultimate commodity. Courtney Love didn't get that kind of redemption. Hole released Live Through This in April 1994, 4 days after Kurt's death, and it was brilliant, raw, furious, emotionally devastating. Critics couldn't decide if Courtney was a genius or if Kurt had secretly written her album, as if women couldn't create without male guidance, as if her talent was less believable than her manipulation. She spent the next 2 decades cycling through addiction, Sobriety, custody battles, bankruptcy. Every fall was public. Every attempt at resurrection was met with skepticism. She'd been Kurt Cobain's wife, and the world never let her be anything else. The question people still ask, did Courtney Love destroy Kurt Cobain? The answer is more complicated than yes or no. They destroyed each other the way fire destroys fire, by existing in the same space, burning the same oxygen, consuming everything combustible until nothing remains but ash. She didn't cause his depression or his addiction or his chronic pain. But she didn't save him from it either, because saving was never possible. They were two people who should have been kept apart by anyone who loved them. But love doesn't work that way. Love is reckless and stupid and convinced that this time will be different, that passion is proof of compatibility, that damage recognizes and repairs damage. What Kurt and Courtney had was real. Searingly, destructively, undeniably real. They understood each other in ways no one else could, spoke a private language composed of shared trauma and dark humor and genuine tenderness. The nights they stayed up talking until dawn, dissecting capitalism and gender and the prison of fame. The way he looked at her when she performed, like she was dangerous and magnificent. The way she looked at him holding their daughter, seeing for a moment the gentle person beneath the noise. These things happened. They mattered. They weren't enough. In the end, Kurt Cobain couldn't survive himself, and Courtney Love couldn't save him. This isn't a failure of love. It's a recognition that love operates within human limitations. Depression is a medical condition, not a moral failing. Addiction is a disease, not a choice. And sometimes two people can love each other completely, toxically, without reservation or survival instinct. And still that love isn't enough to overcome chemistry and chronicity and the accumulated weight of pain that started long before they ever met. Frances Bean Cobain gave an interview when she turned 20, saying she didn't particularly like Nirvana's music. It was too painful, too connected, to loss she couldn't fully articulate. People were scandalized, as if she owed loyalty to art created before her birth. But maybe that was the healthiest response possible, refusing to be defined by other people's nostalgia, choosing to be herself rather than her father's daughter. Kurt would have appreciated that. He'd spent his whole life trying to escape other people's definitions. Courtney never remarried. She dated occasionally, but nothing stuck. How could it? She'd burned at temperatures that make normal relationships look tepid. She'd loved someone so intensely it destroyed them both, and survived to tell the story, which made her either incredibly strong or incredibly cursed, and probably both. She still performs sometimes, her voice raspier but no less fierce, singing songs written in the trenches of the worst relationship of her life, and people applaud the pain without understanding its cost. The greenhouse where Kurt died was torn down years ago. The house in Seattle's Madrona neighborhood sold multiple times, each owner trying to escape the weight of history embedded in the walls. Fans still visit, leaving flowers and letters and guitar picks at the location where genius and suffering intersected permanently. They write messages. You saved me. I understand. Rest in peace. As if peace was something Kurt Cobain had ever experienced. As if rest was possible for someone who spent 27 years fighting his own nervous system. What remains is the music, the photographs, the mythology. Kurt Cobain, in his olive cardigan, looking exhausted and beautiful. Courtney Love in her torn dress, looking dangerous and defiant. Together, looking like the answer to a question no one should have asked. What happens when two wounded people decide to be wounded together? The answer, played out across 4 years of headlines and heartbreak, you get something incandescent and unsustainable, something that burns so brightly it illuminates the darkness but consumes everything it touches. They were beautiful, the way car crashes are beautiful. 3 times they consumed what they most needed: their solitude, their sanity, their capacity to believe love could be salvation. And when it was over, when Kurt had chosen permanent silence and Courtney was left screaming into the void, the world looked at the wreckage and tried to assign blame. But blame is too simple. What they had was too complicated for villains and victims. It was just 2 people drowning, clinging to each other, discovering too late that drowning people can't save drowning people. They can only choose whether to drown together or alone. Kurt chose alone. And Courtney, left behind with a baby and a bass guitar and the eternal accusation in strangers' eyes, discovered that surviving is sometimes the cruelest option. Fame immortalized him, made him forever young, forever tragic, forever meaningful. But she had to keep living, aging, making mistakes, being human in a world that preferred her as a footnote to his legend. That might be the most brutal ending of all. Not the death that garners sympathy, but the life that continues after all the beautiful things have burned away.